In this video, I'll go over the rules of Shogi, or Japanese chess. Shogi is played on a 9x9 board. The pieces are these pentagonal pieces here, and for this video, we'll be using internationalized pieces, as there are plenty of quality videos and resources that use the traditional Chinese characters called kanji in Japanese. The pieces are not distinguished by color in Shogi, but rather by the direction in which they point. And the reason for this is because that when you capture your opponent's pieces, they go into your hand and can be dropped on any free square on the board as long as it's legal. Now the other unique thing about Shogi is that most pieces can promote. In chess, the pawns can promote to any piece, but in Shogi, each piece has its own designated promotion, which you get from flipping the piece over. So for example, in this piece, if you flip it over, you can get this. In this set, promotions are red. I'll talk more about promotion rules after I go over the pieces. The goal of the game is the same as in most types of chess. Checkmate the opponent's king. Technically, you've won when your opponent has no more legal moves, so stalemate is also a win, but also incredibly rare since you can drop captured pieces. So with those basics out of the way, let's go over the pieces. The first piece is the king. The symbol you see here is the kanji that means king, and the king moves exactly like the king in Western chess, where it just moves one space in any direction around it like that. The next piece is the rook. Its Japanese name means flying chariot, so that's why you see the symbol here as a chariot, and it moves exactly like the rook in Western chess, so it can move orthogonally any number of squares, like that. The next piece is the bishop. The symbol you see here is a type of hat worn by Japanese officials, so basically a Japanese bishop, if you will. Its name in Japanese means angle mover or angle goer, but we just refer to it as the bishop. And as such, it moves exactly like the Western bishop, so it moves any number of squares diagonally. The next piece is the knight. Its Japanese name is kasha horse, and as its name suggests, it moves very similar to the Western knight, except it's much more limited in that it can only move to the forward 2 squares, which are these two. And like the Western knight, it can jump over any piece in the way to get there. So it just moves like this, or it moves like that. Next we have the lance. Its Japanese name means incense chariot, so that's why its symbol here is the lance on top of a wheel, the wheel being the chariot part of the piece. So the lance is also a similarly limited piece in that it can only move forwards, like that, any number of squares. Basically, you could think of it as a rook that can only move forwards. Next we have the pawn. The pawn is a very simple piece. It just moves one square forward, and it also captures the same way, unlike in Western chess. So this is all it does, just inches forward, step by step. And it matches its Japanese name, which is foot soldier. The next two pieces are the generals, and they may be a little confusing for Western chess players, but I'll try to make them make sense. On the left we have the gold general, and on the right we have the silver general. All generals can attack the forward 3 squares in front of them, but on top of that they have additional movement. They're short-ranged pieces like the king, and the gold general is able to move one square orthogonally, while the silver general is able to move one square diagonally. So if you think about it like that and just superimpose the forward 3 squares, then those are the movements of the gold and silver generals. Also, I just want to mention that for the internationalized pieces, the shapes of the pieces also correspond to how they move. So for example, on both of these generals, you could see that their headpieces at the top point to the forward 3 squares. And for the silver, you could see these diagonal protrusions down here, which means it could go diagonally backwards. And the gold has these sideways protrusions, as well as this chin guard thing that points downwards. In some ways, you could think of them like kings with certain weaknesses. So the gold general is weak diagonally behind him, and the silver general is weak to its sides and also its back. Next, let's talk about the promoted pieces. So I'll bring back the rook and bishop. These are your major pieces, which means their unpromoted forms are the best unpromoted pieces in the game, and likewise their promoted pieces are even better and are the strongest pieces in the game. Unlike all the other pieces, they have special promotions, but they follow the same pattern in that they just gain king movement. So these are the two promoted pieces. The rook promotes to the dragon king over here, and the bishop promotes to the dragon horse over here. Now, because they both have dragons in their name, the dragon king is typically referred to as a dragon, whereas the dragon horse is typically referred to as a horse. And so just to summarize, the dragon king, since it's a promoted rook, it's still able to move any number of squares orthogonally, but then also gains king movement, so it can cover these diagonal spaces over here. This is considered the best piece in the game. And then the dragon horse here works similarly. It moves diagonally just like its unpromoted form as the bishop. And just like the dragon king, it gains king movement. Now I'm going to talk about the promotions for the rest of the pieces. These 5 pieces laid out here are the minor pieces in the game. That includes the 2 generals over here. And the simple rule for minor piece promotion is that every piece promotes to a gold general. With the exception of the gold general, because the gold general cannot promote to itself. So again, these 4 pieces are basically all the same. They just have different symbols to indicate which minor piece they originated from. You also see a common name for the promoted pawn being referred to as the tokin, which is another way of saying I've reached gold. So to summarize, major pieces gain king movement, and minor pieces become gold after promotion. And before I go on, there's actually one more thing I want to mention. As you can see here, the 2 different kings have slightly different appearances. One is a black king and another is a white king. And if I change to a colored version, you can even see that these are literally black and white kings. This is something unique to the internationalized set, because in Shogi, the 2 sides have different names, which are Sente, the player who goes first, and Gote, the player who goes second. And typically in Japanese literature, Sente is colored black and Gote is colored white. Obviously there's no color on the Shogi board, and this is likely convention carried over from Go, but we also use this for the internationalized set as well. So in this case, the black player here is the first player to go. And I should also take this time to mention that if you play with traditional kanji sets, you'll see, again, 2 different types of kings. One of the kings has a little mark on it over here, and that's the jewel general, while the one without the mark is the king general. And the significance here is that the one with the mark, or the jewel general, is usually played by the lower level player or the more junior player, while the king without the mark is played by the more senior player. Okay, so now that we know how pieces actually move, let's talk a little about how promotions actually work. So as I mentioned before, the board is a 9x9 board, but you could actually divide it into thirds. So the bottom 3 ranks, or rows, are your camp, and the last 3 ranks are the opponent's camp. And the reason why these camps matter is because these camps also correspond to the promotion zones. So if your piece manages to make it past this line over here, then you have the ability to promote. And so the general rule is whenever you move into a promotion zone, or if you start your move within a promotion zone, you have the option to promote. So even if you drop a piece in a promotion zone, it does not automatically promote. All your dropped pieces are unpromoted. But if it's in a promotion zone and again you move it, then it can promote on its turn. Now there are some additional restrictions for promotions, and the first one is if you can no longer move your piece legally after dropping, then you can't do that. So for example, you can't drop a pawn on the last rank because it can't move any further. You can't drop a lance on the last rank because it can't move any further. And you can't drop a knight on the last 2 ranks because it can't move any further. And finally, I want to talk about 2 very special situations that you have to keep in mind at all times. And the first is called Nifu, or double pawn rule, and you can't drop a pawn on a file which already has a pawn. So if Sente over here has a pawn in his hand, I'm going to make this a little bit more realistic and say that pawn over there went to Sente's hand. You cannot drop that pawn anywhere on this board because every file is occupied by a pawn already. If you're strict with the rules, this actually results in immediate loss because you played an illegal move. The second rule, which is less common but is also very important to know, is Uchifuzume, which is the drop pawn mate rule. And you can't mate the opponent's king with a dropped pawn. So in this case, if Sente dropped a pawn right here, this technically would mate the king, except for the fact that it's an illegal move. Any other piece that would checkmate the king would be legal though. So for example, dropping a lance is legal. There are two more rules I should discuss for completion's sake, and these are other ways the game could end. The first is repetition, and there's always a repetition rule for every kind of chess variant, and Shogi is not alone. So repetition in Shogi is also called Senichite, which literally means moves for 1,000 days. And according to the rules for Senichite, you can't repeat the same position on the board for 4 times, otherwise the game will end in a draw. So what I mean by position, I mean the exact pieces on the board, as well as the exact same pieces in the hand, all have to be the same. So just to make this very simple, say this rook is chasing this gold. So I just repeated this position again as a 3rd time. And then now it's in each day. However, if you try to do repetition with perpetual checking, so for example against this king over here, well then that's going to lead to a loss for the player who's perpetually checking. So Sente in this case will lose. And the other situation I want to discuss is the impasse rule. So impasse is when both kings have reached their respective promotion zones. So Sente here has reached the final 3 ranks, and Gote here has reached their final 3 ranks. When this happens, it's actually very hard to mate the king, because if you think about it, all of Shogi's pieces, or most of Shogi's pieces, are strong to the front. So for example here, pawns can only move forwards, lances can only move forwards, knights can only move forward, and the 2 generals are much stronger forwards than they are backwards. And their promoted versions are also all golds, which again are stronger forwards than they are backwards. And since everything is so front heavy, it becomes much harder to drop a piece to mate this king. So for example, if Gote's king is over here, there are very few pieces I can drop. And on top of that, when they drop a piece to protect their king, on the next move, it becomes promoted and they could just form an impenetrable fortress like this, while you're just dropping small little weak pieces, and the only pieces that could actually even do something are just as good as the opponent's pieces. So this is really truly an impasse. And so how is impasse resolved? Well, when both players agree on an impasse, you just score points based on how many pieces each player has. So rooks and bishops, whether they're promoted or not, count as 5 points, and then every other piece is worth 1 point. And if a player has less than 24 points, then that player loses. But otherwise, if they both have more than that, it's a draw. In the final part of this video, I just want to go over some very general basic tips for anyone who's played chess but have no idea how to play shogi. The first one I see beginners often doing is just pushing pawns aimlessly, because in chess it's a good idea to have a pawn structure. Pawn structure does not work the same way in shogi because these pawns do not protect each other as they do in chess. Instead, your pawn structure is really more dependent on your generals, and together with your generals, the generals kind of form the backbone of your pawns. So for example here, these generals already cover so many pawns, and then as you move your pawns, you can continue to reinforce them. But like chess, your pawns should be moved in order to deploy your pieces. So for example, moving this pawn opens up your bishop, which is a very good move. Whereas this pawn, pushing this forward, continues to expand the influence of your rook, and if you continue to do that. If you continue to do that without them defending, then your rook becomes unstoppable. Number 2, keep an eye on pieces in hand and how they can fork your own pieces. So for example, in this situation, where both players go for bishop exchange, now both players have bishops in hand, and bishops are very good at forking. So for example, if Sente is not careful, and for example moves his pawn up here, do you see where a good fork is? Yep, it's taking the bishop and dropping it right in the center and threatening to take this rook and promote, or to take this lance and promote. And sometimes you don't even need to threaten to take a piece. As long as you threaten to promote into the enemy camp, that's also very dangerous, because the last thing you want is a promoted rook or bishop in your territory. Finally, the last point I wanted to make is protect your king. There are so many structures in Shogi that are called castles, and castles are defensive structures that usually require at least 2 gold generals and a silver, and they protect the king. So right now the king is undefended, but let me show you an example of a castle. So for example here, pretend Sente has managed to walk his king over here, and then moved his generals into this position. This is a Mino castle. It's very hard to break because these pieces all protect each other, making the king at least much more protected than he was originally. Over here, this is a very classic castle called the Yagura. And here you can appreciate how strong it is with all these generals protecting each other. And here is an example of Anaguma, which is incredibly hard to penetrate, but also takes a very long time to make. So that was my introduction to Shogi. If you'd like to get into Shogi or learn more and play with other people, there are plenty of dedicated players and communities out there for Shogi. And despite originally being a game with very limited English resources, you'll be able to find plenty of resources to help you develop your game. And also in the description, I'll post a link to Hidechi's Shogi videos, which offer a more in-depth introduction to Shogi strategy, as well as a whole channel devoted to analyzing Shogi games. So as usual, if you'd like to see more about different chess variants as well as Shogi variants, please don't forget to like and subscribe.